Hello, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. This episode is the first of our 4 episodes talking with Adam Paquette, Magic the Gathering illustrator and artist. Adam was so kind to donate 3.5 hours of his time to recording with us this past weekend, and we are so grateful for that. It was such a blast talking to him and finding out where he comes from, not just geographically and historically, but when he approaches his artwork in Magic the Gathering. You can see the passion and energy that he brings to the canvas, be it digital or tangible. This episode, we're going to be talking about pizza cities, emu wars, castle seclusion, and 60-foot paintings, and why Magic the Gathering needs to print bigger cards. But everything else aside, we just want to remind you that this episode is presented by Hipsters of the Coast, which you can find at hipstersofthecoast.com. So, without any further ado, let's get to the show.
Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. This week brings a very special episode as we have a special guest with us. All the way from Deutschland, Magic the Gathering illustrator Adam Paquette is with us. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We're being approved to banter here for a bit, according to the show notes. So,
thanks for putting all the behind the curtain out on Front Street.
This is all improvised, guys. Yeah, I'm in. As I was saying before, I'm in my shared studio in Neukölln, in the bottom of Berlin, south side of Berlin, down near the Ring Barn. And I've asked the construction crew to keep the noise down for an hour, but I have very little control over them, especially as it's the after lunch beer time, and they get a little rowdy with the drills. So we'll see how that goes. So are you guys in Minnesota?
Yeah.
Is that where you are? Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So we're in Minneapolis.
Okay. Is there like a Megaapolis somewhere?
Wow.
Does it become that if it reaches a certain critical size?
As the producer, I should actually just be searching this right now.
Yeah,
I'm just demonstrating my geographical ignorance.
We're in what is typically called in the U.S. flyover country, which is what I had always thought of it as. I'm from California, so you pass over on your way to other places. And now that I live here, it's a great, amazing place to be because people like to be outdoors. A lot of the Nordic and the Germanic people settled here, and they're willing to go out during winter. People don't stop going out just because it's winter time, and I actually really appreciate that.
Now I just have an image of you up in the mountains somewhere, looking up at planes, laughing, suckers, on your way to California. I mean, thinking it's so cool.
The only thing I tell my wife about the hardest part about me settling here was not having mountains is the weirdest thing to me. I grew up in mountains surrounding me. My parents' house is.
Oh, I imagine Minneapolis. I imagined Minnesota having mountains.
No,
it's only artificial ones.
Yeah,
which they make for skiing.
Yeah, real flat around here.
Same as Berlin, actually. We have a bunch of they're hills, then really not mountains at all, but they were built from the rubble after the war.
Oh wow.
And so they collected it all and built these artificial kind of pyramid mountain things and put radio stations on top of them, and a couple of them are parks and stuff like that. But
that's a good way to turn a disaster into something positive. That's awesome.
Yeah. But it's kind of strange. When you get up somewhere high and you look out over the city and you just see these little kind of artificial hills, it's really kind of, I don't know, as you know, coming from Australia, we don't have a lot of visible history. We don't have castles, we don't have war ruins and bullet holes and stuff like that. So being in Europe is a really interesting experience, both in terms of modern history and World War II and stuff like that, and then also driving around and seeing castles and the really old stuff. So that was and still is a new thing for me.
That was banter right there.
Yeah,
nailed it.
Boom.
Always learning. Well, before we get in too deep to some of the stuff that we want to talk today about with your art, Adam, we're going to ask both you and the other co-host to answer an introductory question, our burning inquiry that we normally do. And we like to embarrass people when we have guests on because it's a great way to ensure they'll come back in the future.
We will try.
We want to know, what is your favorite artwork that has been done by Adam to date? I'll start us off because I am afraid that one of my co-hosts will steal my answers. So I'm HobbsQ. I can be found on Twitter at HobbsQ. And you have done so many amazing lands, and we're going to get into that. So I decided to go with one of your actual planeswalkers, which is Freyalise. Because Freyalise was brought back. I mean, we're a lore podcast. We love the storyline. Freyalise is somebody who didn't have a card that we only knew kind of from storylines, flavor texts.
Yeah.
I mean, she's a badass. She's got this eye patch, which, I mean, you give me an eye patch, I'm like ready to go. I love that. But the art just really captures the power of her. And I was just looking at it. I was preparing for the show, and it made me really appreciate how you brought an old character that we didn't really have a lot of reference to life.
Cool. Yeah, likewise. It was the first Planeswalker idea. I haven't done many. I think I've only done 2, in fact. And when I found out, I was like, yeah, Planeswalker, cool. And they're like, yeah, it's one without any existing artwork except for this one painting by Rebecca.
Yep.
Which was like, I think it might have even just been the face.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah,
right in the deep end there. All the other ones have like 60 reference images.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was obviously a really cool thing to also be able to implement that and sort of set the direction for the design. So
no, I mean, I love it because you're basically being asked, like, here you go, just jump in and take over this character that people love, but we haven't really had a lot of reference for.
Yeah.
Don't mess it up.
Yeah.
Here's Michael Jordan, and you're going to follow after Michael Jordan.
Here's a photo of Michael Jordan's ear. Now design Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
Right. My name is Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Findhorn. And I, for a similar reason to yours, Hobbs, I really love the Poliano the High City, the legendary land that you did from Conspiracy, Adam. And cool. It's a similar reason. We don't have any other images of what the Plain of Fiora looks like in sort of a larger scale. And here we get that beautiful imagery of what this elevated city, which we know a little bit from the backstory of the lore, that the people certainly think they are elevated. The wealthy nobles think they're elevated above the common populace, but now we get to see very literally they are so far removed from them and aloof, and that really comes across in that work.
Cool. Yeah, that was really fun. Like, obviously, I think for any painter, Italy is a really important sort of touchstone visually and in terms of architecture and atmosphere. And so it was fun to play around with that, but it was also kind of directly inspired, not in the design, but just in the way that I felt about that city and the kind of upper and lower class by Midgar in Final Fantasy VII. I just like that was one of the strongest kind of memories of my inspiration as a teenager and playing around in these different fantasy worlds, was just this giant kind of pizza city sitting on top of the slums and that train that spiraled around. And so I kind of had that in mind when I painted it. And yeah, it was a fun one.
I'm Alex Newman, found on Twitter at Alexander Newm. And I have changed my card choice about 3 times as we've been recording. For the current favorite art, I'm going to go with Jace's Sanctum.
Yeah, cool.
As an avid reader, I'm just extremely jealous that Jace gets this library.
Right.
And there's just a lot of cool little touches, like the hedron that he's probably examining for some reason, and like little baubles all over the place.
Yeah. That one I did in I'm just like, every time you mention one of my cards, I'm going to tell a story. I hope that's all right.
That's great.
So that one I actually painted I was traveling in Barcelona, and they had a library there. I think it was part of a university. It was in Poblenou. I forget. I think it was a university library that I was using for the Wi-Fi. And and it was like in some kind of aqueduct sort of structure that had been repurposed and turned into this university library. So the architecture, I was basically staring at it while I designed it, give or take. And equally jealous of the collection, because for most of my career, I've been a traveling freelancer and working in different countries. And the thing that I miss the most is having a studio and having a proper place to set up. And even now I have this great studio in Berlin, but all my books and everything are back in Australia, and I have to decide whether I get them shipped over and that kind of stuff. So yeah, there was a lot that went into that one as well. And then all those little bits and pieces on the table, and that idea of what's around that character is studying in that space came up again in Psy Master Thopterist when I designed this character, and he has the bell jars with butterflies in them that he's studying to design the Thopters. That was kind of a throwback to Jace's Sanctum a little bit.
I mean, what I appreciate too is from what we're hearing just even from the start is you've really been able to put your stamp on planes that we know less about, that we only kind of have known from our history and not really getting to see visually until now. I mean, with what we're getting to see in the upcoming sets, and we're getting more of this, conspiracy, or letting us kind of do the commander sets, these supplementals that are letting us see areas that we never got to fully explore in art previously.
Right. I don't know whether to take that as a compliment from Wizards or not. Like, you can do the stuff that we're not sure how it's going to go. We just keep you over here on the side. You can experiment.
We're optimists.
No, it's
great. It's great.
Yeah, we're optimists here, so we're going to say that they're doing it because they trust you.
Yeah. Let's go with that.
So now you get to introduce yourself and make it incredibly awkward by choosing one of your children to give us another story about.
All right. Well, I'm Adam Paquette. You can find me. You probably can't find me. I'm pretty well hidden in the real world, but on the interwebs, you can find me at Adam Paquette on Twitter and Instagram. That's my personal art, and at Adam Paquette _MTG on Instagram for my magic stuff. Ooh, picking one of my favorite children. I was going to say Jace's Sanctum, but
nice.
You poached it. I mean, I think, they all have stories. They all have cool things about them that I can dive into. But I think probably just as the painting that was fun, that I like aesthetically and has a little nod in it, is the vertical island from Zendikar. Because I'd seen a bunch of paintings, like old Russian landscape paintings that were from the top of a mountain, and they were looking down on like a coastal peninsula. And so I put this thing in the very background, and I was really happy with the way that looked. And then I was really happy with the sense of like feeling like I was up on a solid landmass, but in the air. And then I threw in the bucket island that Vince Prost designed for the previous Zendikar set. And he's a buddy of mine. And so it was kind of like probably the first time that I'd included a friend's piece in one of my own as a little nod to something that I thought was really cool. So yeah, that was just a fun, simple, and it went really quickly and smoothly too. And that isn't always the case. So I like it when that happens.
I mean, I love the nod to Vincent, and from a fan perspective, it's knowing that we're on the same plane and seeing things from a different perspective, which is just something we talk on the show a lot about, is perspective and viewpoints and how to view that. And from a fan, getting to see that in the art, that we're basically seeing what we saw before, almost from a different angle, was really cool when that art hit. So we want to talk just a little bit about how you got into creating art, kind of how you begin to get into that process where you got to do art for Magic. Were you a player before? Where did you kind of get into the Magic world?
Because you said that you started painting, and especially oil painting, even before you were doing Magic art, right?
Right. Yeah, long before. So I wasn't one of these kids that grew up with comic books and pop culture and that kind of thing. I think that's probably the answer that you hear most often from Magic artists and illustrators, is that they loved Star Wars, or they loved comics or something like that. And so they had this kind of connection where they were always trying to get into that world and be a part of what inspired them. For me, I came to it all in a kind of roundabout way, which was that when I was younger, I spent a lot of time in nature, and also my mother was doing this work was kind of like cultural liaison work with tribal elders and different people from different cultures around the world. And when they would come out to Australia to do a talk or a visit or something like that, we would sometimes host them at our house, or we would, be spending a lot of time engaging in those discussions. I also grew up in India for a couple of years of my life, on and off, when I was really young. And so I was surrounded by mythology and storytelling from that perspective rather than from pop culture. So I, from a really young age, was writing and coming up with stories and doing a bit of drawing and stuff like that. But I never saw it as connected to this kind of world of entertainment and pop culture. It was connected to, I guess, the history of fine artists and kind of magical and spiritual traditions. And then in high school, towards the end, I chose to do visual art, and it was kind of a midstream switch, let's say, and I did it for the last 2 years of high school, and I felt a really big difference between the way that people engaged with writing and art. And I loved the instant feedback thing of having a sketchbook and someone sees it and they love it or they hate it or they don't understand it or whatever, but straight away, and you don't have to ask someone to sit down and spend 3 weeks reading your manuscript. And so when I left school, I didn't really have a clear idea of what I wanted to do as a career, but I decided to go to art school because I'd found this internet forum called conceptart.org. And like just as I was leaving school, and I suddenly realized there's a whole industry for concept artists and illustrators, and there's digital painting, and there's all this stuff that I, even though I played games and whatnot, I really had no idea that how that worked. So I found that and very quickly fell in love with that world. And a couple of weeks into university, the conceptart.org guys ran a workshop in Amsterdam, the first one that they did. And I spent what little money that I'd saved from my part-time job to head over there and meet those guys and ask for some advice and, like, what's this all about? Is it even possible for someone from Australia to get into this, and so on and so forth. And they kind of asked me what my university course looked like, and I told them, and they were like, this isn't going to work. If you want to do this, you need to be doing life drawing. You need to be, like really painting your butt off. And what you have in this curriculum is a very contemporary art focused course that's very conceptual, and it runs across all different media, and you're not going to get the focus that you need. So one guy in particular, Kevin Llewellyn, or Puddinhead was his online handle. We spent a couple of days together after the workshop, and we went out to a medical museum in Utrecht and studied like Cyclops babies, and it was like a birth deformity museum, let's say. And so we were in there drawing and going out to the red light district at night, and it was also my first time like in Europe. On my own and that kind of thing. So we were walking around at night in these cafes and drawing and talking and whatnot. And that was a huge, huge influence for me, just to see someone doing it independently and living that kind of romantic lifestyle of it. And, with his sketchbook tucked between his backpack and his back at night with paintbrushes sticking out the side. And it was like really an archetypal kind of image for me.
The full bohemian experience right there.
Yeah, 100%. And so I went back to Australia, and I didn't even quit university. I just never went back. Like I just had no interest in it. So like I was getting emails like,
you're actually still enrolled as a student.
Yeah, exactly. I'm the longest. I'm the student that's been there the longest, technically. No, I just never went back. So I started learning on my own, and within a year of that, I started freelancing and had little odd jobs for design studios. There's one design studio that took on a job for doing concept art, and they actually had no idea what concept art was. So, like 6 months later, when the deadline was coming up, they realized they needed an actual concept artist. So that was my first gig. And then gradually, so then eventually at one point, I was part of a little online collective studio on this art forum, and we as a group reached out to D&D to take on commissions as a studio, which I believe they hadn't done before. And so they kicked us a bunch of work and we shared it amongst ourselves and did that for a while. And then gradually most of them dropped off and stopped working for D&D, and I kind of carried on. And then eventually got poached from D&D into Magic when I met Jeremy Jarvis at an art workshop in Massachusetts at the Illustration Masterclass some years later.
At that point, had you really played Magic? I mean, had you delved into it at all?
I never had, and I still haven't really. So I love it when I do play, but I have so much stuff that I want to do in my spare time. I stopped playing video games kind of like, I don't know, in my mid-20s, and like I love it, and every now and then I'll go back and, you know, dabble, and I play Magic when I go to GPs and stuff like that, and I love it. I appreciate it. But I also feel like it's a really hard game to be a part of if you're not keeping up with it regularly, you know. So my earliest memory of Magic was walking past kids playing it in the school library hallway as I was going to find art books, you know, like looking at it like, oh, wasting your time with card games, having no idea that like the art books that I was going to find were the influence for exactly what they were looking at in that moment, you know. So it's kind of funny to look back on that. Not that I ever looked down on it. It was, in fact, I think I was probably jealous because I was, you know, like I was in study mode and I was like, oh man, it'd be cool to like have friends and sit down there in the library and play this cool game, you know? So
yeah, it's very interesting probably now that you've come to it that you don't get to play as much, but now looking into the history of the art that's gone into it.
Right, totally. I think the most interesting thing about Magic artists is this interplay between their personal work and their Magic work, and not just like, oh, it's cool that this artist also does something on the side, but like the way that those things play in and out of each other. And that's something that I've grown to appreciate because of the way that Magic has woven in and out of my life. And it's not just a static thing. It's not just a job that's separated from everything else I do. It's kind of like weirdly, symbolically a part of my life. And even just, you know, the name Magic, like telling all of these people in my life that have no idea what it is that I make magic, you know, and the associations that they make with that. And, you know, in a way, when I say it, like I have all these connotations in the back of my head where it's like, yeah, it is kind of magic. I mean, I have these people over on the other side of the planet that give me money to sit here and design things and do fantasy paintings while I'm living in the jungle in Bali. And somehow it's this thing that rewards me based on how much energy and love I put into it. It gives that back to me. So that is magic. Yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, I look at artists and I'm fascinated to see things that they're working on and also just who they are and what they think and what kind of personalities they are behind this thing that somehow brings us all together and gives us a consistent product that we all work on. So it's kind of an entry point where I see the little differences between my art and Titus's art and whoever's art. And then when you go into that and step into that person's worldview, it goes off in all these unexpected directions.
I mean, we talk about this a lot, that the game is called Magic the Gathering. We emphasize the gathering part here. Right. And I mean, even just the community of artists within that. I mean, we talk about all these different spheres. We have players, we have cosplayers, we have the artists, we have, you know.
I was going to actually ask and sort of follow up on that and just say, like, so a lot of folks, I think that we've talked to, like Titus, when we interviewed him, for instance, he comes from, like you'd said, Star Wars background and sort of also an immersion in fantasy IPs. But because you're coming from immersion in sort of historical, sort of spiritual folklore as your background stuff, how do you think that's sort of influenced your work and made it, I guess, different than a lot of the other artists that we see in Magic?
So I think in the beginning, or let's say on a superficial level, I think that you can see it in my preferences in terms of really simple stuff like what kinds of characters, what kinds of shots, and especially in the beginning when I started and there were fewer art directors and I was specifically working with Jeremy a lot. He really got that, and he'd met me in person as well, which helped. And so he gave me a lot of what he called moments of repose, and he was like, this isn't very common in Magic to have characters that aren't in a combat pose and they're not staring down the camera. And so that and kind of organic landscapes, and I just really wasn't super comfortable with a lot of the cinematic language that had come out of pop culture. Not that I was uncomfortable with it, but it just wasn't in my vocabulary, and I struggled with axe wielding barbarians. So I think you can see it in that level, but then taking it a step further, I'm not so much like, I come from the authentic spiritual world, and people like Titus come from Star Wars. Like, I think that all of that comes ultimately from that dimension. So I see them as different points of access into that deeper thing that people have in different ways. And I mean, I got right into Star Wars for a long time as well through Joseph Campbell and what influenced Star Wars and what created such a tight, powerful mythic structure. So it's just a matter of the difference in how those things are expressed on the surface. But beyond that, how did that background influence it? It definitely came through in Kaladesh a lot, because I was part of the concept team for that. And I grew up in India. So when they were like, we're doing a kind of, roughly Indian themed world, I was right into that, and not just kind of cherry picking the visual stuff, but also, putting a lot of work into trying to influence what the politics of that world were going to be, and kind of gut checking on how that storyline lined up with my, slightly deeper understanding of what it felt like to be in that country, at least. Things like that. And, and the intention behind the work. Like for me, I definitely not all the time, but as often as I possibly can, I check my intention behind the artwork that I'm doing, and like, does this feel right? Even though it's it's part of a game, it's part of a product, it's part of a commercial world. Is my heart in the right place with this painting? Do I think that it carries a nice feeling, or a useful feeling, or some kind of like energy that would be motivating for someone? And so I guess it's there in the background as a kind of barometer.
Yeah, I mean, that mindful kind of approach to it.
Right.
Titus kind of asked us to talk to you. I mean, he personally we sent out a request for questions, and Titus kind of said, he was wondering, could you talk about this crossover of influences from coming from your personal life as an independent artist into the Magic world, and kind of vice versa? And along those lines, is there anything that you've changed about your journey through learning art?
Okay, so as far as what would I have changed in my path up until now, I think so. For me, the biggest dynamic in my life as an artist is this balance between the personal and the professional stuff, which is rife with all sorts of kind of baggage and assumptions that come with being an illustrator. That is, as most of them are, inspired by fine art, historically speaking. And so you're left in this position where you have a day job and you're doing commercial work for a product, but you're inspired by these people that kind of went out before that existed and forged a path for themselves. Even the ones that were, painting for the church or painting politicians, they didn't have an art director. They weren't doing it, through a corporation. They still had to fight for their own identity and to kind of make their way up through those social ranks and be a personality to do that. I would have liked to have stayed at art school in order to experiment more with mediums, because as I develop my fine art, I realize how limited I am in my vocabulary of expression, and I only paint. I'm just a painter when it comes to printmaking or sculpture or video and all of that kind of stuff. I'm like, I don't know, that's not me. I don't know how to do that. And I think that the people that I know that did that art school experience are much more comfortable at experimenting and changing up the format, and the freedom that comes with that would be really good to have at this point. And likewise, I probably would have pushed myself earlier on to do some solo shows and exhibit my fine artwork more, because I had this attitude of, well, I have a job, I paint for Magic, that gives me the money I need to live, and then I do my fine art for myself. And now that it's become really important for me to share my personal work, and I'm trying to put that into play, I'm struggling against, have you done many shows? What's your experience? And like, being in that position, like, I swear I can do it, trust me, you know?
Yeah.
So those are kind of like practical things that I would have done differently. But you know, as far as the rest of it goes, I always really followed my intuition on where I felt like I needed to be, and that often meant moving and doing quite difficult moves, you know, either around Australia or to different countries, or, you know, I was either moving for relationships or personal reasons, or because I was following what I needed for my art. So there's very little that I would change in that regard. And, you know, what has changed over all of that time, I think, is probably less interesting than noticing how much has remained. And, you know, as I've changed situations and contexts so many times, it's really like, well, it's cool to see the things that don't go, and you know, to kind of triangulate who am I really based on, well, I'm not this because when I moved that went and I didn't care. So, okay, that mustn't be a real part of me. This mustn't be a real part of me. What's left at the end of all of that? You know, there's some qualities of, for instance, imagination was something that I never consciously thought about as something that I had. It was very like automatic, and people would be like, "Oh, you have a cool imagination." Yeah, okay, whatever. Like, I don't really know what that means. Thanks, I guess. Don't we all? You know. And
that actually brings up, just real quick. You've kind of been talking about sculpting your own narrative. I mean, you had to determine who you were. You had to create this storyline in your head of who you have been, dropping off the pieces through the years and shifting that viewpoint now that you didn't do art school, you didn't have the other mediums. There are things you could approach, but they kind of shaped where you're at this point. I mean, we always talk about this, just the idea that you're creating your own narrative, you're writing it constantly, and you've had to adjust your viewpoint of who you are. And like you just said, you know, with the imagination piece, even just learning that other people don't have that that same thing as you, because that's what you've known about yourself. So
the weird thing that I do notice in a lot of artists is that we tend to push against the thing that, as in to reject the thing that often is really the most us. And I think that it often happens because the thing that's really us is what other people see and then employ you to do. And then that becomes your day job. And then you think that it's the boring part of you. So for me, you know, I went through a process where I was really into designing things from my imagination, building these fantasy worlds, got into D&D, got into Magic, let's say mastered that job in a professional sense, became an established Magic artist, and then kind of got over it and it started to feel like a job. And then I was like, I want to get away from this stuff and I want to do serious art. And I want to, you know, I want to do less of this imaginative work and do real art. And then the more that I did that, the more it kept coming. It was like, this doesn't feel right. This feels a little bit lifeless. This feels a little bit dead. What's it missing? Oh, right, the imagination thing. And then, but then it was like I had to go and rediscover, like, what is it? Because it's not dragons. It's not, you know, it's not this world or that world or whatever.
No, it's goblins.
What's clearly. Right? Exactly. Yeah, it's really like, what's the essence of that, and why is that so important? I mean, it's you know, and then back to childhood, back to where I grew up, the stories that I heard. You know, like which books and stories and movies made me cry when I saw them and I had no idea why. And maybe now I do. Maybe now I get that. Maybe now I understand more of the world to understand why that thing had an effect on me. So
you talked earlier on about kind of your writing. That was a piece of what you did. Art was a way to, you could get that, you know, your art could be looked at by somebody in minutes or hours versus weeks and days. And I'm curious, we've talked a little bit with, you know, my example of Frey Elise, Joe talking about a plane, we're talking about Jace's Sanctum, these things that are really important to the storyline. How much have you kind of engaged with the lore of the story as you're working on this? Is it a matter of you get a prompt, you're able to look for references and that's it? Or I mean, I guess for us, coming from where we do, we're kind of marrying the lore of the game, the storyline, with real world applications. And we're just curious kind of what your engagement has been with the lore of Magic.
I think it's limited just because I'm not a player. So I think people that are involved in the game all the time have that relationship with the story. What I get fed to me in terms of lore comes through the style guide. So when we get the style guide, we have a front section, which is the bulk of the document, which is the visual reference that goes out for the artists. And in the same document, there's a style guide for the writers that do the flavor text. And so that's where all of the lore lands in that document. And so, originally I never got to that part. I'd go to the page that I needed for reference, or I'd scan through the whole thing to get a visual sense of things. And then I just was like, the writing isn't really super important for me.
Yeah.
Now I do more of that. I definitely, just because it got to I think for the majority of my time with Magic, all I really cared about was, are the paintings good? It was just an image quality thing. At a certain point, I achieved consistency with that, and I felt like, okay, it's not really a question of whether I'm going to be able to hit the target artistically. So what am I going to look for that keeps me interested now? And so that's when I started to dig a little bit more into that part of it.
I'm sure you've got a little more time and energy now too, to sort of, now that you're not focusing so much on those technical elements.
Right. Well, now the new thing is that I'm at least considering or testing out switching to traditional for more of the time. And with that comes this kind of excitement about, okay, like now I feel like I'm actually creating something for the community, like consciously, not just as a byproduct. Like my art director isn't just wizards, and I trust that they know what everyone else wants. And so if I keep them happy, everyone else will be happy. Now it's like, keep them happy. And also I know that this thing is going to go to someone, and it's going to go to someone that probably knows more about this world and appreciates it even more than I do in that way. So what can I give to this hypothetical person? What can I slip in there? So only now have I started to really dig into the wiki, and every time I get a commission, like some things are more interesting than others. Some things I'm like, oh, I'm pretty sure this is an important part of the Magic world, and then I look it up and it's like, not really. Like it's not really that central to everything. It's just a name that's stuck in my head. But yeah, I do get into it more now. But at the same time, I look at it all and I'm like, wow, this is such a developed, complex world with so many storylines and stuff like that. And it's not a world that I am emotionally, wrapped up in as much as I am in my own world and my own life. So I get into it, let's say, just purely through the context of the art that I'm doing for the game. And I wouldn't go too far beyond that. It's this kind of giant co-creation process between hundreds of people that, the artists are feeding stuff back into that ongoing design process, which I don't know if anything else exists that so intermarries, the target audience, the producers and the directors of the project.
It is kind of this modern myth making process in that way, where we all are doing that communal building. I mean, that's sort of what we vaguely talk about on Twitter with the like Magic content creator community, even, is that we just, we love being part of this group of people, including the artists, including wizards, including everybody who just helps to all push all of these ideas into one pile and go, okay, let's see how they all connect. That's awesome to think that way.
Wouldn't it be crazy if like the apocalypse happened and then humanity like slowly reblossomed, and the ancient text that they found was like the Magic wiki, and they thought that it was the history of the world?
Well, in a way, like that goes back to Tolkien. J.R.
Right.
Wrote the Lord of the Rings because he wanted to kind of give the West a deeper mythology and this other thing, and that has kind of made was a forefather of modern fantasy. Magic and D&D and things kind of have been influenced by that, and we're doing that now.
You know what I think is really interesting about Magic that separates it from those things that it came from. Tolkien was a guy, and he was into this mythopoetic way of being an artist, but it came from a vision of what is my idea of the world, and how can I make that metaphorically contained in this thing. Whereas Magic, on the one hand, it does set its own intention and it creates a world, but it also interestingly has this commercial side, and it's based in like gameplay and psychology and the market. And so what you're getting is the creation of a fantasy mythological world, Tolkien-esque, that's combined with some kind of like almost economic mechanism of reflecting the real world we live in. So it's like it expresses our ideals and our fantasies about, you know, the heroic archetype and stuff like that. But at the same time, it's split up and structured in a way that reflects market economics and, you know, and kind of like what's happening in the culture. And I think that's, I mean, new at least, and very interesting. So
what is interesting when you're talking about kind of wanting to maybe re-engage with some of the more traditional art, oil painting, kind of the stuff that you had the history with, versus the digital that you've been doing recently, and especially for Magic. Mm-hmm. If you at this point could talk to Jeremy Jarvis and ask for a commission, you know, what if you had that ability, and we obviously don't know how much of that you can or can't do, if you could, what would you kind of like to do at this point? Is there a certain plane that you would like to envision that we haven't been to? We're just kind of curious what you would seek.
Because of maybe now that you understand a little bit about where I come from, it probably wouldn't surprise you that I want to dig into the foundations of this universe. I was going to say world, many worlds. So I think that I would, I want to get involved in whatever lies under the surface. Like, where did all these planes come from? Like, whether it's Dominaria and going as far. I think like the oldest thing in the kind of official lore is like the Elder Dragons, right? Like that's kind of as far back as it goes ish. Mm-hmm. So like I think things around that, like, what was the creation myth that Tolkien did? The Silmarillion.
Yes.
Like that version. Like I want to do that version of Magic where it's like, what was the prehistoric most ancient version of this, which would probably result in really like abstract card art, like really like what does the void look like before any of the planes came into existence? And, what is the soul of the first Elder Drag, like that kind of weird stuff, and I think there's cool opportunities that happen with stuff like the sagas, where you get to represent these things in non-literal ways. So that would probably be the content. And I think my ultimate fantasy for a commission that would come into my inbox would be, Adam, we would like this painting of the creation of the multiverse, and you have a year to do it, and we'd like a 60-foot oil painting. I want it. Can you rent me a castle big enough to hoist that thing up in, and then I'll get painting?
Oh my gosh!
No, I think like if there was ever a legitimate purpose for something like that, and they were like, we want like the most traditional, epic oil painted thing that kind of somehow expresses the depth of this world, and it's like the opposite of all of this kind of transient digital art stuff. Like this is real concrete stuff. I would be totally on that. That
would be the literal Sistine Chapel of magic art.
Yeah,
like that's amazing.
I was gonna make that reference. They just call you into was it Redmond? Have you just come to the office and then just like, we're gonna have you paint this wall.
Yeah, look, I've been there. It doesn't exactly look like Jace's sanctum, I gotta say. They might have to relocate to Prague.
That's
I mean,
awesome.
I'm also loving this idea of like a 60-foot oil painting that now needs to be able to fit onto a 1-inch by. We want it to look really good on a card, also.
Yeah.
You build a cycle of cards or something. You just break that picture up, and then it gets the collectors to they have to get all the cards so they can put them together and make.
No, I'm sorry. They're just gonna have to print a bigger card.
And that's a solution too.
That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter, or email any questions, comments, or concerns to goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to support your friendly neighborhood gobslugs, you can do so at patreon.com/goblinlorepod. This episode of Goblin Lore was hosted by Hobbs Q, who you can find on Twitter at HobbsQ. This episode was written and researched by Alex Newman, who you can find on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. Engineering, editing, and production for this episode by Joe Redeman, who you can find on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's Fynd Horn. Our music is by Wintergatten, who you can find at wintergatten.com. That's wintergatan.com. Logo by Stephen Raphael on Twitter at Stephen Raffle. Goblin Lore is a presentation of Hipsters of the Coast, which you can find at hipstersofthecoast.com or on Twitter at hipstersmtg. Thank you all for listening, and remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.